قل هذه سبيلي أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني وسبحان الله وما أنا من المشركين.
After this break, we return back to where we had left off, and we start with the fifth book from the 6 books of Hadith, which is known as Sunan an-Nasai. Sunan an-Nasai. And as always, we start off with an extremely brief biography of this great Imam an-Nasai, rahimahullah ta'ala. His kunya is Abu Abdurrahman. His name is Ahmad ibn Shu'aib ibn Ali an-Nasai al-Khurasani. Abu Abdurrahman Ahmad ibn Shu'aib ibn Ali an-Nasai al-Khurasani. And this ascription, an-Nasai al-Khurasani, just as we said in the ascription of Imam at-Tirmidhi, al-Bughi at-Tirmidhi. So it is ascription to something that is more specific and then to something that is more general. So an-Nasai, it is an ascription to the city of Nasa, to the city of Nasa, which is one of the cities of the area of the larger area of Khurasan, which is a city that is present in the larger area of Khurasan, and this is why he is called an-Nasai, ascription to that specific city, and al-Khurasani, ascription to that vast area. And as we said with as-Sijzi, that the area is called Sijistani, but one of the ascriptions to this area is called al-Sijzi, which is against the principle. And Ar-Rai, ascription to it is called Ar-Razi. So similarly, the ascription to Nasa should be upon the principle of the Arabic language, Nasawi. Al-Imam an-Nasawi. And this is also said, some of the scholars of Hadith have mentioned him as Imam an-Nasawi. Imam an-Nasawi, but the more famous of the ascription is Imam an-Nasai. Imam an-Nasai. And this city today, does anyone know in which country Nasa falls today? In Turkmenistan. In Turkmenistan, and it is 18 kilometers to the southwest of the capital of Turkmenistan, which is called Ashgabat. Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. It is near this capital, 18 kilometers to the southwest of this capital falls the city of Nasa. And as we said with some of the cities that have passed, this city today is uninhabited. No one lives in the city. This was a historical city, but today no one lives in the city. As far as the date of birth of Imam an-Nasai, so he was born in the year 215 after the hijrah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was born in the year 215. And he started seeking knowledge from the scholars of Hadith in this area of Nasa and Khurasan, after which he started his travels in seeking the knowledge of Hadith. And we just mentioned regarding Imam at-Tirmidhi that he traveled for a period of 20 years. 20 years in seeking the knowledge of Hadith. Can someone mention or have an idea of how many years Imam Nasai traveled in seeking the knowledge of Hadith? 40. Anyone else?
40 hadith.
You can almost double this. He traveled for a period of 73 years. Since the day he left his area Nasa in seeking the knowledge of Hadith, he never returned back to Nasa. he never returned back to his city. He spent his whole life traveling the east and the west, gathering the hadith of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he passed far away from his place of birth, as we will mention inshallah. He left Nasa, or he started his travel in the year 230 after the Hijrah. And as we said, he was born in the year 215, so how old was he? 15 years of age. He was only 15 years of age when he left his city of Nasa seeking the knowledge of hadith, and he did not return until the day he passed away in the year 303. He passed away in 303. And this young age, 15 years, in which he started his travels for seeking the knowledge of hadith, give proof that he had compiled the hadith of the scholars of Nasa and Khurasan from a very young age. He started seeking his knowledge from a very young age, and at the age of 15 he left his country and city to seek knowledge in the other centers that the muhaddithin were present in that time. From the cities he traveled to, or the areas he traveled to, are the remaining cities in Khurasan and Iraq and Al-Jazeera and Thughur and Al-Sham, Al-Hijaz and Misr.
What is Thughur?
Al-Thughur is the boundary areas of the Islamic Caliphate, Al-Thaghar, where the Muslims protect their lands, the boundary areas that were towards the Roman nation and empire. So I think it is better we explain on the map. Here is the first image, the next one. Here is the map of the country of Turkmenistan today, which is between Uzbekistan and Iran. And this is the capital city of Turkmenistan, Ashgabat. And as you can see, Nasa is to the southwest of this capital, basically on the border of Iran. This is the city that Imam an-Nasai was born in. The next image. This is Ashgabat, this is Nasa, and this is the border between Turkmenistan and Iran. So it's basically on the border of Iran. Next image. And this is a vast rihla, or the travels of Imam an-Nasai in seeking the knowledge of hadith when he left his city of Nasa in the year 230 after the Hijrah of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He first heard hadith from the muhaddithin of this area of Khurasan. So he heard from the muhaddithin of Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, Maro, Nisabur, after which, and Ar-Rai, Qazwin, after which he entered Al-Iraq, and he heard from the muhaddithin of this area, Baghdad, Kufa, Basra, after which he traveled to Al-Hijaz, Mecca and Medina, from which he went north to Egypt, Misr, and Sham, which contains Bayt al-Maqdis in Palestine, and Damascus, to the boundary areas of the Islamic nation in Al-Jazeera, the Thughur, where the Roman nation and empire lied at that time.
Sheikh, who was in Misr? Like Ahle-Hadith?
At that time,
Yeah. Who were they going to see then?
the Misr was conquered from a very early age. Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhuma, he's the one who was sent to conquer Misr in the caliphate of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhum. And there were great scholars of hadith in Misr. From the imams of them was Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, Al-Layth ibn Sa'd rahimahullah, and other great scholars were residing in Misr at that time. So he spent his entire life in this vast travels, to the point that if you can see this area, if you can zoom in, someone can read that, this city, Ar-Ramla, which is today in Palestine. No, Ar-Ramla. And the inscription to is, many scholars have come from this area, Ar-Ramla. So this is the city that he passed away in, rahimahullah, as we will mention. Far away from his birthplace of Nasa in Khurasan. Thousands of kilometers away from the place he was born in, he passed away in Ar-Ramla in the year 303 after the hijrah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he heard from the great muhaddithin of his time that were present in these cities, which were centers for the knowledge of hadith. And as you just heard that he passed away in 303. So he was the one who was the last from the 6 scholars of hadith who passed away. We said Imam Bukhari, when did he pass away? 256. And Imam Muslim, when did he pass away? 261. And Abu Dawud as-Sijistani, when did he pass away? 275. And Imam at-Tirmidhi, when did he pass away? 279. And as we mentioned, Imam Ibn Majah, when did he pass away? Imam Ibn Majah, 272. So the last from them who passed away was Imam an-Nasai, and he lived after the last of them, Imam at-Tirmidhi, who passed away in 279 for a period of almost 25 years. Almost 25 years. Allah blessed him with a long age. He lived a long time. He was born early, like these other scholars of hadith, in the period they were born in. Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, and Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, close to them. But he lived after them for 25 years, after the last of them who passed away. So this allowed him to meet the great scholars of hadith at a very young age that the remaining 5 scholars of hadith met. And he lived for a long time. So this allowed for him to narrate hadith until the beginning of the 4th century, in 303 and near it. So those scholars of hadith who heard from him, their chain of narration is extremely ali. There's very few narrators between them and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is how ulu happens. We just mentioned that the muhaddithin used to give great concern to the matter of ulu, to narrate the hadith with the shortest number of narrators between them and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How does that occur? This way. A scholar starts seeking knowledge at a very young age. He hears from the muhaddithin from a very young age. And then he lives a long time. And he narrates that hadith at the end of his age. And the scholar who hears from him, he also hears it in his young age. So you have a period of almost 100 years where there's only one link. So this is how ulu occurs. So Imam Nasai, he's known to be from the people of ulu, and everyone who narrated hadith by his way, they have very few narrators between him and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he heard from the great scholars of that time. Many of these scholars were from the shuyukh, the teachers of Bukhari and Muslim. Just like Bukhari and Muslim heard from them hadith, Imam Nasai also heard from them hadith. Or we can mention a few of them, such as Imam Qutayba ibn Sa'id al-Baghlani, that we have also mentioned previously. From them is Muhammad ibn Bashar, who we said his laqab, his nickname is Bundar, who is also from the shuyukh of Bukhari and Muslim. Just like Bukhari and Muslim heard from him, Imam Nasai also heard hadith and narrated hadith on his authority in his book. And other than them, in his last part of his life, he traveled to Misr, to Egypt, and he remained in Misr for a long time. He remained in Egypt for a long time, and just a few days or months before his death, he left Misr towards Palestine, where he passed away in Ar-Ramla, rahimullah. We will mention the story and the circumstances in which his death occurred. And in Misr, while he was in Misr, he also was appointed a judge, a qadi in Misr. So he was just not a muhaddith, he was a faqih, like the remaining fuqaha al-muhaddithin that we have mentioned. He extended great care to the science of fiqh and reached the highest level in the science, and based on that he was also appointed by the Islamic Caliphate to be a qadi, to be a judge in Misr. From his most prominent shuyukh are Imam Bukhari himself, rahimahullah, and Imam Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhli, and the great two Imams Abu Zur'a and Abu Hatim al-Raziyan, and Abu Dawud al-Sijistani. All of them are from his teachers and shuyukh. And as we mentioned, a lot of his shuyukh are from the same shuyukh of Bukhari and Muslim, because he was born in 215 and Imam Muslim was born in 206, so there's only 9 years between them in birth. And for example, between him and Imam at-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, there are only 6 years. 6 years difference between him and Imam at-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah in terms of their birth, because both of them were born in the year 209 and he was born in 215. But as we said, he lived a long time after them, and that allowed him to attain ulu in his asanid. And regarding the number of his shuyukh, then a person who has spent this great time in traveling the east and the west, reaching the farthest most boundaries of the Islamic nation in seeking the knowledge of hadith, then without doubt he will have a vast number of shuyukh and teachers he learned from and heard hadith from. The names, those from his shuyukh whose names we know, number 450. Just the names of his shuyukh and his teachers that we know, they are 450 in number. And the names of those who we do not know, they are much more than this. And how do we know the names of this shuyukh? Because Imam an-Nasai himself has a book that we'll mention in his books, in which he has gathered the names of his shuyukh, which is called Tasmiyat Shuyukh an-Nasai. It is a published book in which he has gathered the names of his teachers and scholars of hadith he has heard hadith from by himself, which is one of his books. And other scholars have also authored books gathering the names of his shuyukh, like we have mentioned for Bukhari and Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi. From them, Abu Ali al-Ghassani al-Jayyani, he has a book in which he has gathered the names of the shuyukh and Nasai, like he has done for Imam Abu Dawud that we have just mentioned. As far as his students, then a person who lived such a long age, he has countless students that cannot be enumerated. As we said, between him, for example, and Imam Muslim is only 9 years in terms of birth, but he lived after Imam Muslim for a period of 43 years, or 42 or 43 years. Lived after Imam Muslim for almost half a century. 42 years. So there's no doubt that the number of students of hadith who heard hadith from him, they are countless in number. From the most famous of them is al-Imam al-Hafiz Abu Awana al-Isfarayini and Abu Hatim al-Busti. And we said, who is Abu Hatim al-Busti? Ibn Hibban. He is from his students. Ibn Hibban. From his students is Imam Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi. Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi and Abu Bishr al-Dulabi, and the great Hafiz Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Amr al-Uqayli, the one who has the great book Ad-Du'afa, in which he has gathered the weak narrators of hadith, and other than them. As far as the praise of the scholars upon Imam an-Nasai rahimahullah, then it is a great praise since his lifetime. In his lifetime until today, all the ulama have agreed upon praising him a great praise. from his laqabs, alqabs, nicknames was that he is an imam from the imams of the Muslimin. He is an imam from the imams of the Muslims. Imam min a'immat al-Muslimin. Imam ad-Daraqutni, who reached a great level in this science from the great Huffaz, Muhaddithin, from the great scholars of Hadith, he said that Abu Abdurrahman muqaddam ala kulli man yuzkar bihadha al-ilm min ahli asrihi. That Imam an-Nasai, he is the foremost in the science of Hadith in relation to everyone who lived in his lifetime. There's no one who was more knowledgeable than him in his lifetime that knew this science of Hadith. Imam Abu Ali al-Nisaburi, he said, أخبرنا الإمام في الحديث بلا مدافع أبو عبد الرحمن النسائي. He narrates a hadith on his Sheikh Abu an-Nasai, and he says, he describes him with this description, that the Imam in the science of Hadith narrated to us without any doubt Abu Abdurrahman an-Nasai, rahimahullah. We, in the past lectures, we did not mention matters related to the creed and aqidah of these great imams. And this is a topic in itself, it will take several lectures. These imams were all from the A'immah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Their statements, their action, their books all give proof to the sound creed, the creed of the Salaf. And they have several books and statements in establishing this creed and refuting the various groups and sects of misguidance and deviation. And this is a topic in itself, but we did not mention it, trying to focus on that which relates to the science of Hadith. But here we'll mention something related to the creed of Imam an-Nasai, because it is what caused a trial and tribulation for him, which resulted in his death, rahimahullah. Without a doubt, Imam an-Nasai is from the Imams of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah upon the Aqidah of the Salaf. And his books, rather, Sunan an-Nasai itself is a proof for him that he is upon the correct belief. He has several books in Sunan an-Nasai in which he has narrated several ahadith that give proof to his aqidah, to his creed. Such as, he has a book called Kitab al-Iman in Sunan an-Nasai. All the hadiths in this book give proof to his sound aqidah, for him to be upon the aqidah of the Salaf, rahimahumullah. Kitab al-Iman. It is a book from the books of Sunan an-Nasai, in which, for example, he has a chapter called Babu Tafadul Ahl-Iman. Bab Tafadul Ahl-Iman. That the moment they are of various levels. The movements are not one, they are of varying levels. He has another chapter, Bab Ziyadat al-Iman, chapter of the increasement of Iman, and which gives proof that if Iman can increase, then it can also decrease. So he has several chapter headings that give proof to his sound Aqidah. But we mention this issue because, as we said, he lived in Misr, in Egypt, the last part of his life. And he lived there for a long time. And before his death, by a few months, he left Misr, Egypt, to make Hajj. He made the intention of making Hajj, traveling to Mecca in the year 302. And he passed away in 303. So he left Egypt to make Hajj, and from Egypt, when you leave for Mecca, you have to pass through Sham and Palestine. So while he was on his way to Mecca, he passed through Sham and he entered the city of Damascus, Dimashq. And over there he was tested, a test which resulted in his death, rahimahullah. Which is that over there he authored his well-known book, Fadail Ali. Fadail Ali bin Abi Talib, radiyallahu anhu. The virtues of Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. And with this, the people of Sham, of that area, he was tested, because this was the centers of the Umayyi Caliphate, whose ascription was to Muawiyah bin Abi Sufyan radiyallahu anhuma. So he was tested by authoring this book to a point that he was hurt and he had to leave Damascus. He had to leave Damascus. People raised their hands on him and he had to leave Damascus, and on the way traveling from it in Ar-Ramla, he passed away from the effects of this test when the people raised hands upon him. Rahimahullahu ta'ala. And without a doubt, some people have tried to claim, or they use this book to claim that he was from the Shia. And without a doubt, as we said, he was from the Imams of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And there's not anyone from the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah who refutes the virtues of Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu. There is no one from Ahlul Sunnah who refutes the virtues of Ali bin Abi Talib radiyallahu anhu, who was the fourth caliph of Islam, from the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the cousin of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and his son-in-law. There is no one from Ahlul Sunnah who refutes his virtues. But as we said, this is from the Sunnah of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, that He tests the servants, believing servants of His, and those who He loves. Just like Imam Bukhari was tested, that we mentioned, Imam an-Nasai also was tested with this great test. As far as his books, then he has several books, and we know about 30 of his books. We know the names of 30 of his books, or around 30 of his books. One of the most important of them is, of course, the book Sunan an-Nasai. And another book he has is Sunan al-Kubra. We'll talk about this issue. He has two books in Sunan. One is called Sunan al-Kubra, one is called Sunan al-Sughra. He has two books in Sunan. One is called Sunan al-Kubra, the greater book of the Sunnah. And one is called Sunan al-Sughra, the more concise and smaller book of the Sunnah. From his books is the Kitab al-Du'afa wal-Matrukin, in which he gathered the weak narrators of Ahadith, al-Du'afa wal-Matrukin. From his books that we just said is Tasmiyat Mashayikh an-Nasai, in which he gathered the names of his shuyukh, whom he learned hadith from. From his books is Tabaqat, Fadail Ali, that we just mentioned, radiyallahu anhu, and other than them. And as we said regarding his death, rahimahullah, that his death occurred due to the trial and tribulation that occurred to him in Damascus, in Syria, in which he left and he was traveling towards Ar-Ramla in Palestine, where he passed away, rahimahullah, insha'Allah, shaheedan, in the path of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And this was in the year 303 after the Hijrah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Then we come to the book Sunan an-Nasai, and as we said just right now, that he has two books in the Sunnah, As-Sunan al-Kubra and As-Sunan al-Sughra. The proper name of As-Sunan al-Kubra is As-Sunan, Kitab As-Sunan. This is how he named it, As-Sunan. And the proper name of As-Sunan al-Sughra is Al-Mujtaba. Al-Mujtaba. This is the proper name of Sunan al-Sughra, which is well known as Sunan Nasai. Which is well known as Sunan an-Nasai, al-Mujtaba. And the book that the scholars of hadith, the ulama of hadith, the muhaddithun, considered one of the 6 books of hadith. When we talk about Sunan Nasai, we mean al-Mujtaba, as-Sunan as-Sughra. This is the book that the scholars of hadith have counted as one of the 6 books of hadith. And all the books that have been written on the 6 books of hadith, like Tahzib al-Kamal, Tuhfatul Ashraf, that we have mentioned repeatedly, they use or utilize al-Mujtaba as Sunan al-Nasai. And it is much smaller than a Sunan al-Kubra, which is also published. Sunan al-Kubra is published in several volumes, and from that he concised and compiled his book al-Mujtaba or as-Sunan as-Sughra. We will mention quickly some of the differences between the 2 books. What are the differences between as-Sunan al-Kubra and as-Sunan as-Sughra? So there are 3 main differences. 3 main differences between the 2 books. The first, of course, as is apparent from the name, Sunan al-Kubra is much larger. It contains more ahadith. It contains more kutub and abwab, more chapters than Sunan as-Sughra. This is apparent from the name. So this is one difference. And if we were to give numbers to you to give an idea, for example, Sunan al-Nasai or Sunan Sughra or al-Mujtaba, it has 5,761 ahadith. This is the number of ahadith in Sunan al-Nasai, Sunan Sughra, al-Mujtaba. 5,761. 5,761. But the number of ahadith in Sunan al-Kubra is 11,770 ahadith. 11,770 ahadith, almost double this number. Almost double this number. So this just gives you an idea of, when we say that it is larger, it contains more ahadith and more chapters. This is an example of, to demonstrate that difference. The second difference between Sunan al-Kubra and Sunan al-Sughra is that Sunan al-Sughra only contains a hadith of al-ahkam. It only contains a hadith of al-ahkam and fiqh, of jurisprudence. Just like the other books of the Sunan. Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan Ibn Majah that we'll talk about, etc. contain a hadith of al-ahkam. But Sunan al-Kubra is from the books of al-Jawami'. It contains all chapters of the religion, all types of ahadith, just like Bukhari and Muslim and Tirmidhi. So in addition to ahkam and fiqh, it has ahadith pertaining to the seerah, fadail al-sahaba, the tafsir, and other than it. This is the second difference. The third difference between the 2 books is that the Sunan al-Sughra, al-Mujtaba, which is one of the 6 books of hadith, Sunan Nasai, it is at a higher level of authenticity than a Sunan al-Kubra. The ahadith that are present in Sunan al-Sughra, Sunan Nasai, they are higher level, they are of a higher status in authenticity than Sunan al-Kubra. And this we benefit from Imam Nasai's statement himself. Imam Nasai, his statement himself, where he says that Kitab al-Sunan kulluhu sahihun wa ba'duhu ma'lul. Kitab al-Sunan kulluhu sahihun wa ba'duhu ma'lul. Sunan meaning, as we said, the proper name, as-Sunan meaning as-Sunan al-Kubra. That my book, as-Sunan al-Kubra, it has, most of it is authentic hadith, and ba'duhu ma'lul. Some of it is non-authentic hadith. Then he says, وَالْمُنْتَخَبَ الْمُسَمَّى الْمُجْتَبَى صَحِيحٌ كُلُّهُ. But the concise and summarized book that I extracted from this book, Al-Mujtaba, Sunan al-Sughra, Sunan Nasai, Sahihun kulluhu. It is all authentic. It is all authentic. So this is from Imam al-Nasai rahimahullah in describing these 2 books and the differences between them. And as we said, the proper name of Sunan al-Nasai or Sunan al-Sughra, which is considered one of the 6 books of hadith, is Al-Mujtaba. Al-Mujtaba. And there's also another name that some of the scholars, and they're very few, the majority of the scholars, they say it is Mushtaba. Some of the scholars say that the proper name is al-Mujtana with noon, al-Mujtana, such as Imam al-Zahabi. Imam al-Zahabi has called it al-Mujtana. But as we said, the majority of the scholars call it al-Mushtaba with a ba. And we just read the statement of Imam Nasai himself where he named it al-Mushtaba. وَالْمُنْتَخَبَ الْمُسَمَّى بِالْمُشْتَبَى صَحِيحٌ كُلُّهُ. And regardless if it's Mushtaba or Mushtana, they are all of the same meaning. They are all of the same meaning, which is al-ijtaba, al-ijtina, meaning to extract something, extracting. So he extracted the hadith of Sunan an-Nasai, Sunan al-Sughra from the hadith of Sunan al-Kubra. He extracted and summarized and concised that book in his book Sunan al-Sughra. As far as the reason for why he authored this book, why did Imam al-Nasai author this book? We mentioned the reason for Imam Bukhari authoring his Sahih, did we not? It was upon the guidance of his Sheikh Ishaq ibn Rahuya. So also Imam al-Nasai, there's a reason for him authoring this book, Sunan Nasai al-Sughra, which is that what he himself mentioned, that he says that he gifted his book Sunan al-Kubra. He first authored Sunan al-Kubra, the bigger Sunnah, the bigger book of the Sunnah, and he gifted it to the ruler of Ar-Ramla in Palestine. The ruler of Ar-Ramla in Palestine. So when this ruler pondered upon this book, read it, contemplated it, he asked Imam al-Nasai, أَكُلٌّ مَا فِي هَذَا صَحِيح? Is everything in this book authentic? Or all the hadiths that you have mentioned in this book, that we just said, almost 12,000 hadiths in Sunan al-Kubra, are they authentic? So Imam al-Nasai rahimahullah, he said, La, no, not all the hadiths in Sunan al-Kubra are authentic. So this righteous ruler from the rulers of the Muslims, he told Imam al-Nasai, فَجَرِّدَ الصَّحِيحَ مِنْهُ. He said, so extrapolate only the authentic ahadith from this book. Compile for me only the authentic ahadith from Sunan al-Kubra. And this was the reason that Imam an-Nasai rahimahullah authored his book al-Mushtaba as-Sunan al-Sughra. As far as his methodology in this book, then he has combined or benefited from both the methodology of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim in their Sahih. So he has both the aspects of Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim in his book. So as we said, Imam Bukhari was known for his tabwibat, his chapter headings in which he derived fiqh, jurisprudence, rulings from the ahadith. And similar is the case of Imam an-Nasai rahimahullah. Similar is the case of Imam an-Nasai. And as we mentioned, that Imam Muslim gathers the words, the differing words of a hadith present in his various chains of narrations in one place. So similar is the case of Imam an-Nasai in his Sunan. But there are differences between him and Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim in their Sahih. So from the differences, as we said, that Imam Bukhari splits up the hadith and he only mentions the part that relates to that chapter heading, and he summarizes the hadith. But Imam an-Nasai mentions the hadith in its totality. Mentions the hadith in its totality. This is just like Imam at-Tirmidhi. We said Imam at-Tirmidhi does not summarize or split up, cut up the hadith. But the difference between Nasai and Tirmidhi is that we said Tirmidhi, he rarely, or it is almost not present that he has repeated a hadith. He has repeated a hadith. But Imam an-Nasai, he repeats the hadith. He repeats the hadith. But when he repeats the hadith, he will repeat it in its totality. He will repeat it in its totality. So if he were to need the same hadith in 10 chapters, in his book he will repeat the total hadith in 10 places. He will repeat the total hadith in 10 places. This is different than Imam al-Bukhari. He repeats the hadith, but he just mentions that part of that hadith that is in relation to that chapter, and the other part in that chapter. Imam Nasai repeats the whole hadith. If he needed it 10 times, he will repeat it 10 times. And we said, as we said, he is similar to Muslim, where he has combined the words found in the various chains of narration of this hadith, and he's extremely precise in mentioning which from the narrators mention which word and which from the narrators mention which other word. And he has given special care to a topic that was not found in many of the books before him, which is that he has given special care to mentioning the hidden defects of ahadith, the hidden defects that are present in ahadith, the ilal al-ahadith, and criticizing the ahadith. So just like we said for Imam at-Tirmidhi recently, in the book Sunan itself, Imam Nasai criticizes some of the chains of narration and speaks upon the hidden defects of the chains of narration. Now we come to a very important topic, which is the position of Sunan al-Nasai amongst the 6 books of hadith. We said the most authentic of them is Sahih al-Bukhari, then Sahih Muslim. Abu Dawud at-Tirmidhi, as we said, based on the criteria that we mentioned, some scholars have placed Abu Dawud first, then Tirmidhi, some have placed Tirmidhi, then Abu Dawud. Where does Nasai fall in this ranking?
After Muslim.
After Muslim? 5. After Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi?
Yeah.
Third. Ahsantum.
No way.
In authenticity, he comes after the Sahihain. In authenticity, it is the most authentic book from the 6 books after Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. And we'll mention the proofs for that. So it is the most authentic book from the 6 books after Bukhari and Muslim, which leads us to ask the question, why is it mentioned 5th in the well-known ranking amongst the students and Muslims, where they say Sunan Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Abi Dawud, Sunan Jami' at-Tirmidhi, Sunan Nasai, then Sunan Ibn Majah.
It was compiled after this.
He was the last of them to pass away. His book was the last of them to come to existence. So this was...
We can understand Nasai first if we read the Abu Dawud and then you can understand the importance of Nasai.
So this leads to another problem. Okay, if he was the last of them who passed away, why is he not mentioned after Sunan Ibn Majah?
Because you said yesterday Ibn Majah was recently.
Ahsantum, Jazakumullah khair. He is not mentioned after Sunan Ibn Majah because Sunan Ibn Majah was added to the 6 books of hadith in later centuries, almost in the 7th, 8th century. And as we said, the scholars differed as to which is the 6th book of hadith. Some said Muwatta, Malik, some said Musnad al-Darimi, and the majority of them agreed upon that it is Sunan Ibn Majah. So this is the reason that Sunan Ibn Majah is mentioned after Sunan an-Nasai. The biggest proof of Sunan an-Nasai being the most authentic book after the Sahihain from amongst the 6 books of hadith is the statement of Imam Nasai we just read, where he said that the Mushtaba is Sahihun kulluhu, is all of it is authentic. And also the reason for authoring this book, when the ruler of Ramla asked him if everything in Sunan al-Kubra is authentic, he said no, so he told him to just extracted the Sahih Hadith from this book, which he did in Al-Mushtaba. However, we have to, just generalization, we have to mention something that makes it more specific. We have to mention something that makes it more specific. His statement that Sahihun kullu, that all of it is authentic, it comes in opposition to that which he himself has said, that he criticizes a hadith in Sunan al-Nasai, and he mentions the hidden defects of a hadith in Sunan al-Nasai. So we combine those two matters, and we say that the condition or the position of the hadith of Sunan al-Nasai is that all the hadith that Imam al-Nasai he has mentioned in Sunan al-Nasai are authentic, except those hadith which he has mentioned hidden defects or critique of. Those hadith that he has criticized or mentioned hidden defects of, other than them, then the rest of it is Sahih, near Imam an-Nasai. And due to this, many of the scholars of hadith from past generations, the great scholars and muhaddithin of this ummah, have in their books mentioned and described Sunan al-Nasai as being Sahih al-Nasai. Sahih al-Nasai. Many of the scholars of hadith. From them, the great Imam and Hafiz ad-Daraqutni, rahimahullah, who passed away in the year 385 after the Hijrah. He used to describe or mention Sunan al-Nasai by saying Sahih al-Nasai. Sahih al-Nasai. And this is something that the scholars of istiqra, those who read and combine and collect and research, they have mentioned. This is not something that we are mentioning. Imam al-Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who we said is from the ulama of istiqra, he mentions that إذا سكت النسائي عن حديث ولم يعله بإحدى الطرق السابقة التي هي وسيلته في علالها فهو صحيح عنده. That Imam al-Nasai, if he were to remain silent on a hadith and he did not criticize it or mention any defect in it, then it is authentic near him. Then it is authentic near him. The same condition that we mentioned, we took from the statement of Imam al-Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And why did he reach this level? I want to ask a question. And we have mentioned this before, just to understand if the brothers are understanding what is being said. Why did Sunan Nasai reach this level? Why is it mentioned after the Sahihain in authenticity? What made it reach this level? Now.
It's because of the repetition of the hadith, and he was staying in full, so he wasn't breaking it up. That would be one of the reasons. And yeah.
Because of the tabaqat.
Ahsantum. The issue that we mentioned of the position and the status of the narrators of this, the narrators that are present in the chain of narrations of this ahadith. So we mentioned Imam Bukhari reached this level because he narrates on the first tabaqah, the first level, and Muslim because he narrates on the second tabaqah, and Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, the third and the fourth tabaqah. We mentioned this repeatedly. So Imam an-Nasai reached this level because he has an extremely strict condition in the narrators that are present in the chain of narrations of the hadith, to the point that some narrators that Imam Bukhari and Muslim narrated upon, Imam Nasai did not narrate upon them in his book. Some of the narrators that Bukhari and Muslim narrated upon, Imam an-Nasai did not narrate upon. We have a great statement here that Imam Abu Fadl ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi, from the great muhaddithin, Abu Fadl ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi, who is well known, his laqab is Ibn al-Qaysarani. He says that I asked one of the great muhaddithin, Sa'd ibn Ali al-Zanjani, Sa'd ibn Ali al-Zanjani, on a narrator of hadith. I asked him regarding a narrator of hadith. So he said huwa thiqa. He's thiqa. He is from the highest level of the narrators of hadith in authenticity. He is thiqa. So I said to him, Imam Ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi says, so I said to him, However, Imam Nasai deems him to be weak. Imam Nasai, rahimahullah, deems this narrator to be weak. So, this great muhaddis, Sa'ad ibn Ali, Az-Zanjani says, Ya bunay, inna li abi Abdurrahman shartan fi rijal ashaddu min shart al-Bukhari wa Muslim. That, oh my son, oh my student, Imam Nasai has a condition, a standard in the narrators of hadith that is even more strict than Bukhari and Muslim. That is even more strict than Bukhari and Muslim. Imam Nasai, if he found 2 or 3 mistakes from a narrator of hadith, he would leave his hadith. From the thousands of hadith this narrator has narrated, if he found 2 or 3 mistakes, he would leave his hadith in totality. This was his condition in the narrators of hadith, which allowed his book to raise in rank and be mentioned after the Sahihain in authenticity. Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he narrates on Ahmad ibn Mahbub al-Ramli that he heard Imam al-Nasai say that لما عزمت على جمع السنن استخرت الله في الرواية عن شيوخ كان في القلب منهم بعد الشيء فوقعت الخير على تركهم فنزلت في جملة من الأحاديث كنت أعلو فيها عنهم. That when I made the intention of authoring Sunan al-Nasai al-Sughra, I asked Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala about some narratives of hadith in which I had some doubt in my heart. After which I left narrating a hadith upon them. Even though if I were to narrate hadith upon them, I would have reached the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with ulu, with very few narrators between them and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even with this, the great regard the muhaddithin gave to ulu, he left narrating upon these narrators because he just had some doubts in his heart regarding them. And as we said, Imam Nasai has no thulathiyat. Sunan Nasai has no thulathiyat. The highest he has is rubai. There are 4 narrators between him and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this gives proof to the strict condition of Imam Nasai in the narrators of the hadith that he narrated, and why his book raised in status after the Sahihain. As far as the number of hadith in Sunan Nasai, we mentioned that 5,761 hadith. And this is of course adding the repeated hadith that we mentioned. He repeats the hadith in totality. So adding that is 5,761. And as far as the status of Sunan Nasai in between the 6 books of hadith, we said that it is after the Sahihain. And the scholars have given proof for that. Imam al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, as we said, who is from the great scholars in the Khatimatul Muhaddithin, he says, وفي الجملة فكتاب النسائي أقل الكتب بعد الصحيحين حديثا ضعيفا ورجلا مجروحا. That Sunan al-Nasai is the least of the books from the 6 books of hadith after the Sahihain which contains unauthentic hadith. The least number of unauthentic hadith from the 6 books of hadith are in Sunan al-Nasai, because the Sahihain, everything is authentic in it. So from the remaining 4 books, the least number of unauthentic hadith are in Sunan al-Nasai. And he says, وَرَجُلًا مَجْرُوحًا. And the least number of criticized narrators are in Sunan al-Nasai. The least number of narrators which are criticized by the scholars of hadith, the least of them are present in Sunan al-Nasai. And his student, al-Imam al-Hafiz al-Sakhawi, he agreed with him and he added, وَلَكِنْ إِنَّمَا أَخَّرُوهُ عَنْ أَبِي دَاوُدْ وَالتِّرْمِذِي فِي مَا يَظْهَرْ لِتَأَخُّرِهِ عَنْهُمَا فِي الْوَفَاةِ. What we just mentioned. That even with this, they mentioned Sunan Nasai after Abu Dawud wa Tirmidhi because he passed away way after them. This is from the statement of Imam Sakhawi, that he is mentioned after him because he passed away much after them. As far as the books that have been written in service of this book, then there are plenty and several in number. But sadly, they do not reach the service that the other 4 books of hadith that have passed, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi. Rather, from the very strange aspects is that there has been no explanation of this book written since the author passed away, 303, for several centuries. No explanation of this book reached us for several centuries until Imam as-Suyuti. Imam as-Suyuti, who is much later in death. He passed away in 911 after the Hijrah. 911, meaning almost
1,500 years, right?
he passed away almost 400 years ago. So 6 centuries almost passed away before the first sharh of this book was authored that reached us, which is the sharh of Imam as-Suyuti. And in reality it should not even be called a sharh, explanation. They're hashia. It is called a hashia, brief notes in which he has added brief notes to some of the hadith and has left off many of the hadith, and most of these notes are 1 and 2 lines in length. And his book is called Zahrul Ruba al-Mushtaba. Zahrul Ruba al-Mushtaba, which is well known as Hashiyat al-Suyuti ala Sunan Nasai. The notes of Imam al-Suyuti upon Sunan an-Nasai. So we said that this is one of the first sharh, if we can call it that, hashia that has reached us. After that, another scholars from the scholars of India who migrated to Medina long time ago, Imam Nuruddin Muhammad ibn Abdul Hadi as-Sindhi, Muhammad bin Abdul Hadi as-Sindhi, who passed away in the year 1138 after the Hijrah. 1138. He was from the old Muhajirin who migrated from Pakistan, that is today, from the area of Sindh to Medina. He also wrote a hashia, brief notes on Sunan Ibn an-Nasai, which are published together with the notes of Imam as-Suyuti. Both these notes are published together. They were extremely brief notes. And the ulama always, the scholars, the students of hadith always sense this gap and lack of service to this great book without explanation, until Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala guided one of the great muhaddithin of our times from our teachers, al-Shaykh al-Allama Muhammad bin Ali Adam al-Ethiopi, rahimahullah, who passed away just last year. Just 1 year or maybe even less than 1 year ago, who was from the country of Ethiopia, Habasha, but he migrated to Mecca at a very young age, and he lived his entire life in Mecca, and he was the muhaddith of Mecca, and he used to teach in Al-Haram al-Makki, and he made his life mission to author an explanation of this great book, which alhamdulillah he finished in his lifetime, and it has been published by the name Zakhiratul Uqba fi Sharh al-Mushtaba. Zakhiratul Uqba fi Sharh al-Mushtaba. And he gave it its due right, because this book is published in 40 volumes. In 40 volumes. Extremely large explanation. Every hadith taking 50, 100 pages. And I advise all the students of hadith and knowledge to refer back to this book, and they will find great benefit in this book.
Sheikh, did you do Abu Dawud too?
He started other books of hadith, but he did not complete except Sahih Muslim. He started other books of hadith. He started Sunan Ibn Majah also, but he could not complete it before his death.
How many volumes you say?
Sahih Muslim is also almost 25-30 volumes. His sharh, explanation of Sahih Muslim. So this is from the best sharh, complete explanation of Sunan an-Nasai, Zakhiratul Uqba, fi sharh al-Mushtaba. And other books that have serviced this book, we have mentioned previously. If anyone wants to find a biography of the narrator from the narrator of Sunan Nasai, he refers back to the book Tahzib al-Kamal. And anyone wants to do takhrij of a hadith in Sunan Nasai, he refers back to the book Tuhfatul Ashraf. Those books that have serviced the 6 books of hadith, Sunan Nasai is included in them. And with this, we have finished Sunan Nasai. If there are any questions, then they can be presented, inshallah.
Will Imam Nasai take a hadith from all the tabaqat, or?
No, as we said, his condition in the narratives of hadith is extremely strict. Extremely strict. To a point that we mentioned, that the scholars have mentioned, he left off the hadith of some of the narrators of al-Bukhari and Muslim. So he has an extremely strict condition, of course, which means that he usually narrates the hadith from the first tabaqa. Usually from the first tabaqa. No.
Since a lot of these muhaddisin, they have already provided rulings in their books, right?
Yeah.
So the muhaddisin of this era or after them who do the takhrij, do they do it on the ones that are da'if and just leave the sahih with their own rulings?
Ahsantum. This is a good question the brother asked, is that as we mentioned, Imam Tirmidhi, he has ruled upon every hadith he has mentioned in his book. Ruled on every single hadith he has mentioned in Jami' Tirmidhi. And we mentioned here that Imam an-Nasai himself has criticized and mentioned the hidden defects of a hadith. And we mentioned regarding Abu Dawud, Imam Abu Dawud, that he has mentioned or ruled upon the hadith that are extremely weak. That are extremely weak. So a student of knowledge benefits from these rulings. A student of knowledge benefits from these rulings. Rather, it is befitting that when he does takhrij of this ahadith, when he collects the chains of narrations of this ahadith, along with it he also gathers the rulings of the scholars, such as these great scholars and huffaz and muhaddithin on this ahadith. He gathers on this ahadith, and he studies this ahadith based on the principles of ilm al-hadith, based on the principles of the science of ilm al-hadith. So if his ruling is in agreement with the ruling of these scholars, or some of them, he mentions their ruling along with his ruling to show that he is not alone in this ruling. Rather, great muhaddithin and huffaz from before have agreed with him in this ruling. And if his ruling, based on the science of hadith, it opposes the ruling of one of the scholars, then upon him is to answer the ruling of that scholar. Why has he opposed it? Based on the sciences, the principles of the science. Based on the principles of the science. For example, Imam al-Haythami, rahimahullah, from the teachers of Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Nuruddin al-Haythami, rahimahullah. He has a book in which he has gathered the zawaid of several books upon the 6 books of hadith. The hadith that are not found in the 6 books of hadith, which is called Majma' al-Zawaid. Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid. Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid. In this book, he rules upon every hadith that he mentions. He rules upon every hadith that he mentions. He is from the respected scholars of hadith of this nation, from the teachers of Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. But the way he rules upon the hadith, he would mention, so and so has narrated this hadith, وَرِجَالُهُ ثِقَات. That is, his narrators are thiqat. They are memorizers of the highest level of memory. You will find many of his rulings, he will say, وَرِجَالُهُ ثِقَات. So some of the students of knowledge or hadith they use this ruling and they understand it to mean that he has ruled upon the hadith in its totality, which is not the case. So if a student of knowledge does takhrij of this hadith and finds that it is weak, and for example Imam Haythami says that rijaluhu thiqat, so the way of answering this is that he only ruled on the narrators of this chain, that they are thiqat. But with them being thiqat, there's a break in the chain of narration. There's a break in the chain of narration. There's tadlis, for example. It is mudallas, or it is mursal, for example. Or there's a hidden defect in this hadith, for example. Or it is shaz, it opposes the more authentic hadith. So this is the way that a student of knowledge and hadith answers the rulings of the scholars with total respect and following the principles of this science. And this is the way of the scholars of today, and it will remain the way of the students of hadith until the end of times. We benefit from all of the scholars that have passed before us, and their rulings and their statements are held in high regard, the highest of regard, and we follow the principles that they followed, and if they are in agreement, then praise be to Allah. And if there is a disagreement, then with respect you try to give answers as to why your ruling has opposed their ruling. Now, yeah. One of the sisters, she asked that you said that all hadith that are in Sunan as-Sughra, Sunan Nasai are authentic. Then you said that the least number of unauthentic hadith are in Sunan as-Sughra, Sunan Nasai. Please elaborate. Does it mean that unauthentic hadith are found in Sunan as-Sughra? So as we said, this is not our statement. This is what the scholars of hadith said, and this is what Imam an-Nasai himself said regarding Sunan as-Sughra, that all of it is so authentic, that we just read his statement and Hafiz ibn Hajar's statement, rahimahullah. But as you listened, Hafiz ibn Hajar added a very important word, فَهُوَ صَحِيحٌ إِنْدَهُ, that it is authentic near Imam an-Nasai, rahimahullah. Imam an-Nasai is a scholar of hadith like the other scholars of hadith. So in his viewpoint and his ijtihad, the books, the hadith that he has collected in this book, all of it is authentic. But it does not mean that the other scholars of hadith like Imam Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Tirmidhi, other muhaddithin, they might not agree with some of the hadith that he has mentioned in his book and deem them to be unauthentic. So this is according to his ijtihad. His condition was to just gather or just extrapolate the authentic hadith from Sunan al-Kubra according to his ijtihad, which he did, and this was his condition that he followed. But as the scholars have mentioned, he followed this condition to a great extent, which allowed this book to raise in rank, and the least number of unauthentic hadith are found in Sunan an-Nasai, Also there's another question. This sister, she asked about, you said that an-Nasai found some mistakes in the narratives that Bukhari and Muslim found, that Bukhari and Muslim narrated a hadith upon. So can you give more elaboration? As we said, this is a statement also the scholars have mentioned, that Imam an-Nasai, he has left off a hadith of even some of the narrators of Bukhari and Muslim. He had an extreme strict condition in narrators of hadith, and as we said, the principles of this science are unified upon. All of the scholars of hadith from its inception until today, they follow the same principles. The difference comes in implementation, application of these principles, in which there is a matter of ijtihad that is involved. So if Imam an-Nasai viewed one of the narrators from these narrators to be weak, In opposition to him we have who? Imam al-Bukhari, who viewed him to be authentic. We have Imam Muslim, who viewed him to be authentic. And we might have other scholars who view him to be authentic. And even with Nasai, rahimahullah, we might have other scholars like Abu Zura, Abu Hatim, who view him to be unauthentic. So this is a matter of ijtihad between the scholars. And as I said, this is not something that is that problematic as the people may seem. If someone follows the sciences of hadith and the principles of this hadith, then he will understand these issues in much more detail and can answer the doubts regarding this issue. Someone said, why did an-Nasai include unauthentic ahadith in his Sunan al-Kubra? We just said that Sunan al-Kubra, from the differences between it and Sunan Nasai, it contains, or Sunan al-Sughra, it is higher in level of authenticity than Sunan al-Kubra. And the leader of Ramla asked Imam al-Nasai to just extrapolate the Sahih ahadith from Sunan al-Kubra, which gives proof that they are unauthentic ahadith in Sunan al-Kubra. Rather, Imam Nasai himself mentioned, Sahihun kulluhu wa ma'lulun ba'duhu. It contains authentic ahadith and it also contains some non-authentic ahadith. So why did he mention this ahadith? For the same reason that the other muhaddithin have mentioned unauthentic ahadith in their books, like Sunan Abi Dawud that he mentioned, Jami' at-Tirmidhi, because these are ahadith that either the fuqaha they used for their fiqh, or this is one of the proofs of the fuqaha, or they acted upon it, or they said by it, or they left it for the scholars after them. Maybe they'll find another chain of narration that will raise this hadith in rank and it will become Hasan li ghayrihi, or they view that the speech of the Prophet Muhammad is better than the speech of men, and other than that, from the reasons that we have mentioned. There's a great saying the scholars of hadith repeat always, which is man asnada faqad ahala. Man asnada faqad ahala. What does this mean? That the one who mentioned the chain of narration, he has freed himself from blame. The one who mentions the chain of narration, he has freed himself from blame. This is something well known near the muhaddithin. Man asnada faqad ahala. The one who mentions the chain of narration, he has freed himself from blame, and he has directed the listener, the reader, to the chain of narration. He has not hidden anything. He has conveyed it with integrity. And this was from the ways of the scholars of hadith. They wrote these books for the students of hadith in their times. So the students of hadith, when they will read this asanid, they will know they are weak. That was the level of knowledge at that time. He mentioned the chain of narration and he directed you to the defect. The narrators that are weak, most of the scholars of hadith at the time had memorized them. The second you hear this narrator, you know this hadith is weak. So this was their way. As long as he has mentioned a chain of narration, then he has freed himself and shown you the way. Shown you the way. So this is from the reasons, and the other reasons that they have mentioned these hadith in their books now.
You should spread the Sunan Nasai.
No, as we said,
we know that it has the highest level, right? And
yeah.
Most of the ahadiths are deemed to be authentic.
Yeah. So how can you differ between the authentic and the non-authentic? There are weak ahadith, so you must refer back to the scholars. And if you find a statement from one of the scholars that says that this is Sahih Hadith, then inshallah that is the most upon you, and you can spread it inshallah. Now.
In our time now, us being ignorant, you have the muhaqqiqeen from our time.
No.
For instance, Shaykh Abdul the Qadir,
No.
Shakir, Sheikh Al-Bani, Zubair Ali,
No.
all the popular ones now, their books are being published. What's the reason why, and how should we look at it? Like, for instance, you mentioned Hafid Iraqi and Hafid
Al-Haythami.
Yeah, we've heard that these scholars, they rule on these things.
No, they have ruled upon the hadith, yeah.
What do we do? Shouldn't we go back with the further older scholars, or in our time we just try to get benefit because we're ignorant ourselves? We take what we can.
I mean, of course, for a student of knowledge, student of hadith, he should gather the statements of all the scholars. He should gather and benefit from the statements of all the scholars who preceded him. This will strengthen his position in the conclusion he reaches. Either there will be an agreement or most of them which will give strength to his conclusion. As far as a layman, then of course we cannot ask him to refer back to the books of the major scholars. This is not at their level. So just like as Allah has said, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So they ask the people, or they refer to the people that are around them, or they are easily accessible. The rulings are available, like Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah, who was from his times. His rulings are accessible. They have now, I guess, programs and websites that have included his rulings. So he acts upon that. I can't expect someone to refer to Hafiz al-Iraqi and find the ruling. It is not practical. No.
What are the reasons do you think that has such a long period to explain this Nasai?
I mean, we don't have a reason. This is from the Mashiach of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. And there's a saying that the scholars mentioned that how much knowledge and virtues and blessings the past scholars left for the present scholars. If everything was done, then we wouldn't have anything to do in this science and in this knowledge. So they have left that virtue and blessing for the scholars who come after them, so they can attain this virtue and blessing. Kam taraka sabiq lillahiq. How much have the past scholars left for the present scholars? And this science, alhamdulillah, until today there are books that come to existence in service of this science, and these books that were not present before. So it will continue inshallah until the end of times now.
With such a strong and stricter conditions than Bukhari and Muslim, how were the weak hadith managed to come in Nasai? You have explained the increase of...
No, as I said, when the scholars mentioned this, that he has a strict condition. We did not say he has a stricter condition than Bukhari and Muslim. We said he has a strict condition, to the point that he even left out a hadith of some of the narrators of Bukhari and Muslim. This is what we said. Not that he has a stricter condition, a higher condition than Bukhari and Muslim. So he had a strict condition to the point he left off some ahadith on Bukhari and Muslim. So he did not have a stricter condition than Bukhari and Muslim. No. If we'll take a break now before we start the last book, inshallah, Sunan Ibn Majah.
وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين وما خلقت الجن والإنس إلا ليعبدون